was an excellent presentation, nice and brief and succinct, and for me, I'm sure for you, raises a lot of questions. Glenn asked me if I would sort of kick off. What we're going to do is spend a little bit of time now to get some questions from the audience, but he asked me to kick it off, and my question from listening to that presentation is very simple. What strikes me most is the numbers associated with the amount of land that's been designated, and you know, what is happening on the ground. And you look at that one graph of, if we do all this, basically it's 0.9% change, which is not much different. So the question to me that I would put to both Marcy and Philippa is, are we aiming high enough? Do we have targets that in fact are going to make a difference? So let's kick it off that way. Marcy, do you want to start?
Well, I'll just, I mean, I think, you know, although the business as usual study was a different study, I don't know if you can hear me here, I think it's a pretty good comparison of sort of a market-based approach of what we would have gotten had we developed in a certain way. And there is not much difference in terms of the designated land. Again, to Philippa's point, that doesn't mean that we have to actually use all of that land to 2031. But I think if we look around, so some of you may be familiar with the growing city studies that we did in 2010, which compares the growth patterns of Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. And we recently updated that analysis to a 20-year period. And what it shows across the board, we actually added Edmonton to the mix as well. But what it shows across the board is from 2001 to 2010, all these Canadian cities grew more densely at the edge. And some of it was through policy, some of it was just through I think, sort of a natural process of densification. And so in Calgary, an election was fought over, and won, I might add, by council members who thought that 65 people plus 65 people, and some wanted 70 people plus jobs, were what we needed to aim for in terms of a density target on greenfield densities.
Okay, Philippa, do you have comments?
I think that this shows the result of some unintended effects. Until we did this study, nobody had really put the figures together. I think the upper tiers were working largely in isolation from one another. So they all thought, well, if we go a little lower, then it's not going to make a big difference to the region as a whole. But everybody thought that. And then the cumulative effect was to reduce the targets for the region as a whole and the potential outcome for the region as a whole. So it's unfortunate that somebody didn't look at this a little sooner and perhaps reconsider those exemptions and changes in the light of the region as a whole. I think there was too much of independent action by different jurisdictions without anybody sort of at home base saying, wait a second, you know, how do these things all fit together? It surprised us when we found it, and I think it may surprise other people who read it.
Okay, I guess related to that, I've got a couple of brief comments, and I want to open up the audience. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes of questions of both our first two speakers, and then we're going to invite Larry up and the rest of the panel and really get into the bigger discussion. But one of the things that listening to the presentation strikes me back when I was chief planner at the city is I used to attend meetings of the regional planning commissioners. And one of the things that I always was astounded by was the absolute constant need for more land to be designated. And, you know, I remember saying, you know, I'm not so sure this makes any sense, because, you know, logic is if you continue to allocate more land, you're going to get the same end result. And as everybody here knows, by and large, the City of Toronto hasn't had any greenfield land for ages, yet the population has skyrocketed. Now, we know that the downtown core is the main reason for that. So I think there is something here to this number of the 107,000 hectares and the amount of land that's needed. And one of the questions that I would like to see answered is, what if there were no new lands designated, or in fact, there was an exercise looked at redeveloping all of the underutilized soft sites in every municipality, all the shopping plaza malls and the strip plazas and, you know, the stuff that has the one-story buildings on it. We did an exercise a long time ago for the Toronto Official Plan called Fast Forward, and we just looked at the soft site analysis of the property zone commercial residential as of right on all the main streets. And then we allocated, we used criteria, and the end result was we ended up with 1,500 properties out of 160 kilometers that had the potential to redevelop in a substantial way. And we did a simple calculation. If you put 6-story buildings on the 1,500 properties, retail at grade, housing above, you get 120,000 units of housing on 1,500 sites. And so I call into question this issue of the amount of land designated. So that's one comment I'll throw out for disagreement or debate or whatever. And the second is related to other cities. I mean, Vancouver is often referred to as another example of intensification. Different context, we all know, border, ocean, mountains, limited land supply. But their intensification targets, as far as I'm aware, are much, much higher, and the end results are much more aggressive. So just a couple of comments to throw out to hopefully stimulate some discussion and questions. So who wants to kick this off? We have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience of Marcy and Philippe. Okay, Leith, looks like you're the first one.
Oh. I wanted to point out that Bannockburn deserves special treatment because it's sacred ground in this country for us Scots.
I don't think that was a question.
I have another suggestion. I think that Neptis should study green sprawl. I think if you're going to look at acres and how many acres are needed to support anything, take a look at what the net developable acreage trend is on any greenfield plan over the last decade. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I know it, but I'd like you to study it because I think it has a dramatic impact on the numbers you're looking at.
Comments on that?
What's the question?
Yeah.
It was more of an invitation for them to do a study on green sprawl. What is the net developable acreage on a typical plan now versus 10 years ago?
Any reaction, comments? Do you think that's a good idea?
I like the way you're going with that, and yes, we should certainly maybe take some case studies and look at that.
Okay, great. Now let's get this going. Here's a question over here. Sorry, I don't know all your names. Introduce yourself, maybe.
Dave McClary from Strategy Corp.
Okay.
I looked at 4 issues, and I'll frame it this way. We have 10% unemployment in Ontario. We have 20% unemployment of 20-somethings and above. Okay? We are losing jobs at an incredible rate. The only thing the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments all agree on, and all 3 parties agree on, is the economy. I suggest that Neptis go back and we look at urban models. We should come back and take a look at what is happening in Britain right now. And I refer you to a report by a lady by the name of Kate Barker. You might want to Google her. And you might want to look at the planning reforms that are underway in Britain. And what those reforms are centered on is that planning policy is having a fundamental ability or fundamental impact on the ability to compete for jobs and growth and to provide for housing choice, including affordability. The impact of places to grow on the economy and the ability of Ontario to compete has to be a fundamental issue. It was not addressed within Places to Grow 1, yet it is at the root. So if you go out to Brantford and spend some time out there and talk to the people, you'll find that jobs, not 50 employees per acre, are the issues. And they're not going to be office jobs that go to Brantford. So I suggest you take a look at what is going on in Britain with regard to planning reforms. They are now going to release 1 million acres of land to deal with the housing affordability crisis. And that's not saying that people should own houses, it's just availability at rents. I believe that Ontario is heading down that path. Lastly, there has been collateral damage of Places to Grow. I believe that we have fundamentally altered the land economics. There are 70 applications right now in Toronto to convert employment lands to residential because of the warping of the land economics. A good example of collateral damage is Mr. Christie's. 700 jobs were gone like that, and that is because of that impact. We are also having a problem that when a company wants to invest $330 million to build new facilities, retain 600 jobs in Ontario, and grow them to 1,200, it's taken them 3 years to go through the approvals process. It would have taken another 3 years had the minister not intervened with the minister's zoning order to approve it, yet it does not meet your density requirements. So do we execute that 600 jobs and lose those 600 future jobs, or do we stand by a density target? So I'll put the point, is there a fifth issue here, is the economy and affordability.
Okay, thanks. There's a lot of commentary there, and hopefully it'll stimulate more discussion. So do you want to respond, please?
Well, I think that what we're suggesting is we need to take a look at, I mean, I started off by saying I think we need to take a critical, thoughtful look at the policies in the plan and whether they're working or not. And I think certainly employment has been raised as an issue, and whether the treatment of employment lands, the fuzziness of how to figure out how employment works within the 50 people plus jobs has been acknowledged. And that I think further study needs to happen on that. But I think is an example of a region that has that was in the mode of expanding and expanding and expanding at the edge, Calgary. It's now turned around to say we don't want to do that anymore, because there are costs to that, long-term costs to that. Certainly, there's economic costs to it, but I just think it's an example of the opposite effect of what you're saying. A very successful economy, but it's changed its land use patterns.
Okay, well, I see Dan there waiting with bated breath, so let's get you on the floor, Dan.
Thanks, Paul. Dan Leeming, Planning Partnership. My question is, the density and growth, I agree, are all very good ideas and long overdue. The point being is the underpinning to density really is infrastructure. You have to enable the density to happen in an appropriate manner. And you may very well be coming to this later in this discussion. And I certainly, hats off to the folks at Metrolinx who are pushing that very big boulder up the hill. However, a number of urban nodes that are emerging in greenfield areas, started in response to places to grow, are delivering the numbers that municipalities are trying to hit. A number of those are now coming through to approval time. And builders, developers are looking at these as, yes, it's a good idea, we know it's coming. It's a market sector they want to get into. But the problem being is, as it comes along, if transit isn't there, if transit hasn't caught up and is able to deliver the urban lifestyle, those units aren't going to get built. So you're self-defeating, because you got to go to not one underground garage, $30,000, $35,000 a pop. You got to go to two, because they don't have a choice. And even 2 cars is less than a lot of average of other suburban areas. So you're talking about $70,000 extra costs on a condo to put 2 cars, because the bus at a higher order level or other level of transit isn't there. So it's stalling. It's starting to hit the wall. And what I find interesting is the diagram in front of us is great. We know Berlin and Madrid has had pretty sophisticated transit for a long time. And Chicago has done quite well and is catching up. Atlanta 20 years ago was abysmal. But with federal funding, it has launched a significant transit system. Toronto in the middle, trying to achieve what a compact forum like Europe doesn't have the funding like the States has in catching up with their transit. So we're kind of caught in the middle of knowing where we want to go, but we can't get there. And I appreciate the wheels are turning, but I think everyone in the room knows we should have started 30 years ago.
Okay, thanks for that. Maybe, I think in all of that commentary, there might be a question of, I've talked to Larry about this, the big move is due to be reviewed, the big move plan. Surely to God, the big move in places to grow ought to be reviewed together so that we know what's going on. The last thing we need is a review of the growth plan, and then a year or two later, a review of the big move. So that's just my 2 cents worth. Any comment?
I would agree with that.
Certainly, another shameless plug for the GeoWeb. We have plotted all of those. We have plotted the big move as well as the places to grow areas, and you can see whether they line up or they don't. You can look for yourself.
Okay. And we all know the story about transit funding, and we're waiting to see what comes forward in the next provincial budget. So maybe that'll stimulate some more discussion here. I think, Tony, in the back, you are waiting for a question?
Thank you, Paul, and I do have a question.
Good.
This is something that has troubled me a little bit about all the numbers with the density analyses since with the growth plan. And I'd be interested in the panelists' thoughts about this. It's all from a very fixed, once you develop, everything is fixed in stone. So if we develop a subdivision and the planners say, yeah, it's great, because it's, let's say it's residential only, so it's the number of dwellings that represent 50 persons per hectare, that number of dwellings stays fixed. And over time, at least the experience has been to date in the post-war era, that the density of that subdivision will decline. If an industrial park is built, let's say an Amazon warehouse or whatever, and it has been justified on the basis of 50 jobs per hectare, our experience, especially in the last couple of decades, is that over time, the labor force in that place is reduced. The building stays fixed, and the number of people working there decline through greater efficiency and greater productivity. So there is, in all of this sophisticated calculation, there's a built-in machine constantly reducing the density of what we build. So, and I'm interested in knowing, I've never quite figured out how that's addressed in the growth plan, nor am I quite clear whether Neptis in its own analysis have looked at that, so I'm just interested in the panelists' views on that. Thank you.
Okay, comments?
Want to talk about growing cities at all? Or?
Well, I was also going to mention that in the commentary of the growth plan early on, 2006, 2007, Neptis put that out. We acknowledge this issue that densities change. I mean, when you're measuring density at people and job, the number of people and jobs change within the same unit, within the same building over time. So it's a very kind of squishy metric and difficult to track.
And recent updating of the Growing Cities report, it doesn't just affect greenfields, it's also affecting residential densities. Right. So you can continue to add units and units and units within the built-up area, but the population may not be changing. It may be going down, or it may be staying the same. And the update to the Growing Cities characterizes this as running very, very hard to stay in the same place. So you have to keep adding units, and it's all because of declining household size, aging population, and so forth. So that is a paradox, and I don't think the growth plan fully encompasses the meaning of that paradox and how we are going to deal with this. I don't think it addresses the whole question of an aging society either.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes left before I invite the rest of the panel up here. Anyone else got any burning questions of our first two speakers? No? Otherwise, let's thank them for their presentation. And I would ask the panel members to come up.